Suddenly the nightstick flashed, backhanded, directly into Elder Meekum's face, catching him across the bridge of his nose. Elder Meekum spun away and grabbed his face. Another slashing blow caught him across the head, and he fell to his knees. Elder Thomas dropped to the ground, grabbed his companion's shoulder, and shielded him with his body from more blows. "Please don't," he pleaded. "That's enough." Elder Thomas heard Elder Meekum whisper, "If I get up, I'll kill him. Hold me down." Elder Thomas tightened his grip. "What did he say?" Kellerman demanded. "He's sorry. He said that he is sorry." "You lie. I heard him say kill." No, he wouldn't say that." "Get up, both of you." Elder Thomas stood up, but Elder Meekum was still on all fours. "Get up, I said!" Suddenly he thrust the toe of his boot hard into Elder Meekum's side. Elder Meekum took the blow with a grunt, but he hardly moved. Elder Thomas knelt next to him again. "Stand up," he was pleading, and then to Kellerman, "He'll get up now." And slowly Elder Meekum did climb to his feet. Blood was running down the sides of his nose onto his chin. He wiped his hand through it, smearing it across his lip and cheek. But then he stared into Kellerman's eyes, looking more defiant than hurt. "Apologize to me, and to my flag," Kellerman said in German. He looked excited, tense, ready to use the stick again. Elder Meekum said nothing, but Elder Thomas only let a second or two pass before he said, "He doesn't understand you." And then in English, "Elder, you've got to say you're sorry." Elder Meekum just stood his ground, his jaw set. "Just say you're sorry." "Es tut mir leid," Elder Meekum finally said. But his tone said, "Just try it again." Kellerman looked confused. He had clearly not expected this concession, however insincere. "I'm not finished with you," he said. His thick lips tightened into a grim frown, but it all seemed an act. Under the surface was an obvious well of weakness. "You think you can defy the Führer, but you cannot. My leaders tell me you are harmless boys, but I know better. They will listen to me now. You haven't heard the last from me." He turned on his heels and marched away. "I should have broken his jaw," Elder Meekum said. "Come on, Elder, that's not what we're here for. I'm not going to bow down to that guy the way you did." Elder Thomas was frustrated, scared for what might happen if Elder Meekum couldn't learn from this. But he was also ashamed of himself. He wished that he hadn't groveled before Kellerman. "You broke my nose," Elder Meekum said. "Are you sure?" "Doesn't matter, it's been broken before." Elder Thomas took his arm and turned to him. "Oh, man, the back of your head is cut too. You're bleeding pretty bad." He reached in his back pocket for a handkerchief and handed it to Elder Meekum, who dabbed at his face and then at his head. "We better get home as fast as we can. Come on." Elder Meekum took a couple of steps and then said, "Don't walk too fast. My side hurts." "I'll bet he broke your ribs." "Maybe." He was leaning forward, his eyes squinted, and his jaw clamped tight. Elder Thomas heard a little grunt with each step he took. "Do you want to lean on me?" "No, let's just get home." "Can you ride a bike?" "I don't know." "All right, then. We'll leave our bikes and take the streetcar. We'll go back to the apartment, and then I'll get in touch with President Wood. He'll know what to do." Chapter 5. 3 weeks later, Elder Thomas received a new companion, Elder Roland Sawyer from Los Angeles. By then, President Wood had transferred Elder Meekum to Stuttgart. Elder Thomas liked Elder Sawyer well enough, but he was a quiet young man, and not half as interesting as Elder Meekum had always been. For a couple of months, Elder Thomas did his work carefully and quietly, and he stayed away from Bruder Goldfarb. Finally, however, he decided he needed a new suit, and he had no reason not to go to his friend for that. When the elders visited Brother Goldfarb, they found an emaciated, broken man. He had lost almost all his business, and he had very little hope that things would get better. He missed his wife and daughter desperately. The elders prayed with him and wished him their best, and they promised to visit his wife, to bring him back word how she was doing. When they visited Sister Goldfarb, however, they found a woman every bit as disillusioned as her husband. She was doubting everything, even God. The missionaries returned for the suit, but they were careful what they said. At least they could tell Brother Goldfarb that his wife was all right. They didn't tell him how the children in the neighborhood called his little daughter a filthy Jew. On the day after their second visit to Brother Goldfarb's shop, the elders got up early, as always. Each took a spit bath at the sink in their room, and then they put in their morning study hour. Elder Thomas was trying to read the Old Testament in German, and he was struggling with that, but he had his mind well focused on the chore when a rap came on the door. It was the time of day when the district president, Elder Dunford, sometimes stopped by, and so Elder Thomas wasn't surprised at the knock. But when he opened the door, he saw President Mize from the Frankfurt branch. "I must talk to you," he said, and he stepped forward. Elder Thomas shut the door and then invited President Mize to sit down, but President Mize stood where he was. "There's something you must know," he said. "Bruder Goldfarb was questioned last night, and beaten." "What? Who did it?" "That's not for me to say, and that's not important. It was the Gestapo, wasn't it?" Suddenly President Mize's voice sharpened. "It was you, Elder Thomas. It was you who got him in trouble. You have been going there even though I told you not to." "Yes, but only to—" Elder Thomas couldn't believe this. An avalanche of guilt was coming down on him. Why should they beat him? "I don't know that. I only know that a Gestapo agent was at my door early this morning. He warned me, if members of our church contact Goldfarb again, we won't be allowed to hold our meetings. We'll be disbanded, and I could be arrested." "Was it Kellerman? Is that who came to your door?" "That's not your concern." Elder Thomas saw what was happening. "Elder Meekum and I had trouble with an agent named Kellerman," he said, "but his leaders won't let him arrest us because we're Americans. He must be trying to get at us some other way." President Mize was a stout man, a builder by trade. He had a square, solid face, but he also had a kindly smile with a flashing gold tooth when he was in the mood to smile. Now his lips were pressed tightly together. He pointed a finger at Elder Thomas. "You have no idea the trouble you are causing. You must never go there again. Bruder Goldfarb might have been killed." "President Mize, people are being beaten for no reason. Do you defend that? Do you think it's right?" President Mize spoke with care. "Bruder, I haven't said I like everything that is happening, but I must deal with reality. To the Nazis, Bruder Goldfarb is not one of us. He is a Jew. We must not do anything that will bring harm to him, and we must protect the church. That's simply how things are. We'll stay away from him now. I promise you that." "Be certain you do," President Mize said, and then he left. Chapter 6. "Runners, take your marks." Wally turned and walked back to his starting holes. "Good luck, Wally," he heard his friend Mel call out. As the runners began to place their feet in their marks and crouch for the start, quiet fell over the field. Wally leaned forward and held his arms out for balance. "Get set!" Wally tensed. He felt the presence of the runners near him, but his focus was down the track as though he were looking through a tunnel. No one was going to beat him to that first turn. Crack! The gun fired and Wally burst from his marks. He jumped into the lead so suddenly that the other runners were already out of his vision as he angled toward the inside of the track and headed for the corner. He took the first turn cruising, the chopping sound of the cinders the only evidence that he was even touching the ground. Hold back, he tried to tell himself, but he couldn't contain the energy that was pulling him into the backstretch. As he came out of the corner, the whistle in his ears disappeared, and he knew that the wind was with him now, and he was still floating, still running without strain. "Take it easy, Wally, take it easy," he heard Coach Morse calling from across the track, and he knew the man was right. But he wanted that record. He would give everything he had and then gut out the finish, no matter what it cost him. He could hear no one behind him, and he wasn't about to glance back and foul up the stride he had going. But as he neared the end of the backstretch and started into the second turn, he knew for the first time that he had pushed himself too hard, too early. The pain hit him suddenly. His legs had turned heavy, and as he came out of the turn and picked up the sound of the wind again, he felt his stride break. He almost stumbled, but he muscled his way through and tried to thrust his legs to find his rhythm again. He heard everyone screaming, "Keep going, Wally, keep going, push!" It was all as though he were swimming underwater, with the sound of the people out there somewhere above the surface. Still, he tried to respond. He pressed harder, but everything was shutting down, and now he heard the footsteps, heard the crowd noise intensify, and then he felt a runner coming alongside him. He could sense the height of him, saw his long arms swinging. Wally reached for something more and held his own, and the two battled forward, both losing speed, but straining to match each other step for step. And then Wally let go. With 20 yards to run, his body simply surrendered. He commanded himself not to give up, but his stride faltered. Almost at a stop, he took a final step across the line as another runner slipped by him and took second. Wally dropped to his knees. He fell forward, scraping his forearms into the track, and then dropped his face onto his arms. He didn't care whether he cut himself. He sucked for air and waited for some relief from the sickness. He wanted to vomit, wanted to do it right there on the track and end the agony. But two people had hold of him, grasping him by the arms and around the middle. They were pulling him up. "Don't," Wally managed to grunt. "Walk it off," Mel was saying. "You'll be all right." "Leave me alone," Wally tried to say, but nothing came out. He bent forward and breathed for maybe a minute, and then he found the energy to pull himself free. He stumbled a few steps forward, bent over and put his hands on his knees, then took deep breaths until he could walk to the end of the bleachers. There, he stepped underneath, grabbed a metal strut and bent over again. He felt the convulsion in his stomach, the acid in his nose, but a second later he already felt better. He spat on the ground, waited to see whether there would be more. When Wally stepped out from under the bleachers, he saw his coach coming. "Let me have a look at you," Coach Morse said. "How bad is it?" "Not bad. I just got scratched." The illness was gone now, and the blood wasn't that important. "I've got a first aid kit out here," the coach said. "Walk back to—" "No, I'll just go shower." He started to walk away, but it was only then that he realized he had made a decision. He stopped and turned back. "Coach, I'm quitting." "What?" "I'm quitting track. I don't like it. I can't do it." "Wally, you went out too fast. But if you keep training hard, you'll hang on for those final yards and beat those guys. You have a good shot at the city championship." "No, I can't do it. I'm sorry." And Wally walked away. He didn't go back to the track for his warm-ups or his gym bag. He just walked into the locker room. He wanted to get away from the school as fast as he could.
This completes the first CD. Please insert CD number 2 to continue with the program.
Two hours later, Wally was upstairs in his room, lying on his bed. When he heard heavy footsteps on the stairs, he knew his dad was coming. How does he know already? Wally asked himself. A moment later, he heard a knock and then heard his dad's voice. "Wally?" "Yeah." The door came open. Dad took a step inside and then pushed the two wings of his double-breasted suit coat aside and stuffed his hands into his pockets. He was still wearing his hat. Wally dropped his head back onto his pillow. "Your coach called me. He said you were quitting the team." "That's right. I told him you were probably upset by what happened, but I promised him you wouldn't quit." "You shouldn't have told him that." Dad stepped closer. He pulled his hat off and held it. Wally looked away at the ceiling, but he could hear his dad breathing hard as though he were trying to control his anger. "I told Coach Morse that I don't raise quitters." "Only one," Wally said. "For crying out loud, son, what are you talking about? Can't you take a setback? Your coach told me that you're faster than Alex ever was. All you need to do is put in more work." "Is that what Alex did? Work harder than me?" "I don't know, but he always gave it all he had, and he didn't back down from any challenge." "Well, I'm not Alex. Never was, never will be. He's made of better stuff, as you have pointed out to me many times before." President Thomas stepped closer to the bed. "Sit up," he said. "Look at me and talk to me like a man." Wally did sit up, and for the first time he looked his father straight in the eyes. He was furious, and he didn't mind letting his eyes show it. "Wally, your team won today, in spite of you. The only relay East lost was the one you were supposed to run. But South is stronger, and the coach says he'll need you to have a chance to win the city championship." Wally had thought this through more than his dad realized. He was not going back out on the track. "Dad, I told you. I quit the team. I'm not going to change my mind." Wally saw the skin along his father's throat turn deep red, and he sensed that he had won. He suddenly felt powerful. He stood up. "Where were you today, anyway? You always went to Alex's track meets." "That's not true. I went when I could, and I would have been there today if I could have made it. I can't just drop everything and run off every time I want to." "You told me this morning you would come." "No, I said I would if I could get away. But something came up. A man in our stake needed to see me. It wasn't the sort of thing I could put off." "So it was church business." "Yes, it was in this case. I do have my church calling too, Wally. That's something you ought to understand by now." "Oh, I do understand. You always put the church ahead of our family. We all know that." Wally wasn't even sure he believed that. But it was the closest weapon he could find, and he was fighting back. Dad stared at Wally, and he seemed to calm. Maybe he gave up. "You're pitiful, Wally," he finally said. "You don't have the guts to finish a race, but you won't take responsibility for that. You have to blame it on me and the church." "No, I already admitted I'm a quitter." "Well, then you do what you want, Wally. Quit the team and quit everything else that's hard in life and see what that will do for you." He stood for another moment as though he hoped for a change of heart, but Wally only said, "Fine, Dad. That'll be my plan. I'll be the family quitter." What a shame, Wally. When I think what God has given you and what you're doing with it, my heart just breaks." He turned and walked from the room. He shut the door, pulled it until the lock clicked. Wally heard the sound like a gunshot and felt the pain of it. He dropped back onto the bed, pulled the pillow over his face, and tried not to cry, but the tears came anyway. He pressed the pillow tighter, trying hard not to let go. What he wished at the moment was that he had the power to keep pressing until he smothered himself. Wally knew the truth. It wasn't just that he had quit today. It was that he didn't have what it took to win. He had tried as hard as he had ever tried in his life, but something inside him was simply too weak. When Williamson had kept pushing, Wally couldn't. Dad didn't understand that Wally hadn't decided to quit. Something inside had decided for him. He turned on his side and looked at the other bed. Alex had been gone from the room for 1.5 years, but he was still hovering over Wally, and there was no escaping him. Chapter 7. When Bobby opened the front door, she found herself hoping that her parents wouldn't be there, or at least that her dad might have gone off to a meeting. She was wearing her new spring outfit, a white flare skirt, the new skating skirt look that Sonia Henney had made popular, a lavender vest, white gloves, and a little round hat with a jaunty feather in it. She had spent a long time on her hair, too, which was pulled tight against her head on top, but ended in curls. She liked the way she looked, but she knew what was coming that night, and she was nervous. Phil stepped in behind her, his hand clasped against her waist with a new sense of ownership. She saw her dad sitting by the tall Philco console radio, listening to a news broadcast and reading the newspaper at the same time. LaRue and Beverly were on the floor, sitting cross-legged, playing a card game, Old Maid or Animal Rummy, and Mom was sitting under a lamp on the couch, stitching on another of her endless needlework projects. At least Wally wasn't there. "Daddy, Phil wanted to—" But Phil stepped forward quickly and said, "President Thomas, I'd like to have a little chat with you, if I could." Everyone looked up. The little girls smiled knowingly. "Woo-hoo," LaRue said, and Beverly giggled. Bobby glanced at her mother, who gave her a little nod and smile. "Certainly," Dad said as he folded his paper. "Let's step into my office." So Phil and President Thomas walked through the dining room to the office in back, and Bobby was left with the females of the family all beaming at her. She sat on the couch at the opposite end from her mother, and she felt terribly self-conscious. "Oh, Bobby, this is so wonderful," Mom said. She smiled contentedly, her dimples appearing. She put down her needlework and reached her hand in Bobby's direction. Bobby took her hand for a moment, but she didn't say anything. When she heard footsteps on the stairs, she hoped Jean was the one coming down, but she saw Wally, and her breath caught. She wished she had never said anything to him. When Dad and Phil returned a few minutes later, they both looked pleased. Phil was dressed fit to kill in a gray flannel suit and maroon tie. His hair was combed perfectly with a wave in the front, and he was showing off those good teeth. He had a square jaw, square deal sort of look, every maiden's dream. But Bobby wished he didn't look quite so pleased with himself. President Thomas stepped ahead of Phil. He reached for the lapels of his coat, found nothing, since he didn't have his coat on, and then let his hands drop. "Where's Jean?" he said. "At the Ward House playing basketball," Mom said. "Well, I'll talk to him later. At least the rest of us are together, for once." The radio was still on, and a dance band was playing an upbeat song, jitterbug music. Dad stepped over and turned it off. "This is a wonderful occasion," he said. "Brother Clark has asked for Barbara's hand in marriage, and I've told him that we are honored to join our family to his." Phil nodded. He was trying to look serious, but he was glowing. "Some might think it's old-fashioned to ask a father's permission, but it's the proper order of things. Phil is a young man with a wonderful heritage and a wonderful future." Then Dad smiled. "And I look forward to his posterity." "They can name their kids after you, Dad," Wally said. "The boys could all be named Alexander and the girls Alexandria." Lately, Dad had not had a lot of patience with Wally, but he smiled now. "That's not necessary. Some could be David or Thomas," he said, and he grinned, but then he cleared his throat. "Well, anyway, we welcome you to our family, Phil. We couldn't be happier." And the two men shook hands. Mom got up and walked to Phil. "I've got to have more than a handshake," she said. She spread her arms wide, and Phil bent over to hug her. "I'm thrilled to death." Then she came back to Bobby, who stood up and accepted Mom's embrace. "This is just perfect. It's a dream come true," she told Bobby. And Bobby felt good about that. It seemed right to please her parents so much. When everyone had had a chance to congratulate the pair, and the girls had each received a hug from Phil, he gave Bobby his arm and led her outside to his car. "I love you, sweetheart," Phil said when he got into the car. He gave her a kiss on the cheek. Then he shifted the gears, twisted to look over his shoulder, and backed out of the driveway. He had never called her anything like that before. This was part of the new condition, Bobby supposed, the new relationship. But Bobby didn't think she could call him honey or dear or any of those pretty little names. "I want to take you to my house so we can tell my parents," Phil said once he was driving. "But let's do that later. I have dinner reservations coming up in about," he checked his watch, "20 minutes. This is working out just right. Where are we going?" "I thought we'd go to the Empire Room at the Hotel Utah. The food is good, I'm told, and they have dancing. Ray Bradford and his orchestra. Is that all right with you?" "Sure. Is something the matter?" "No, not at all." He patted her leg, something he had also not done before. "I do want to talk to you about one thing," Bobby said. She had planned to wait until later, but now she knew she wanted to get this worked out before she had the ring on her finger. "Sure, what is it?" Bobby hadn't thought this out in words, so she hardly knew where to start. She took her hat off and set it on her lap. At the same time, a car in front of them slowed and Phil had to brake and then shift gears. Bobby used all this to stall, to think, but no words came to her mind until she actually began to speak. "I want to finish college, Phil. It's important to me. And if we get married too soon, I'm afraid I never will. Never will go back, or never—" She stopped, tried to think. "I just want to wait until then." "Until when?" "Well, couldn't we wait until I graduate? I'm not even 20 yet, so that would—" "Bobby, what are you talking about? That's 2 years." She had tried to think how he would react, but she was surprised by the strength of his response, the harshness in his voice. "I know that, but lots of people are engaged that long. My aunt was engaged the whole time my uncle was on his mission." "Well, sure, he was gone, but I can't— 2 years would be way too long." "I don't see why, Phil." "Bobby, think about it." But he couldn't seem to find a way to say it. "I was thinking this fall wouldn't be too soon." "Then what do I do about college?" "Why is that so important, Bobby? Dad's willing to see me the rest of the way through law school. After that, I'll make a good living. I can support you just fine. Why do you need a college degree?" "I don't need it, necessarily." "Then why bother? You won't have to work, I'll see to that." "It's something I want to do," Bobby said. "I made up my mind about that a long time ago." She leaned away from him, with her hand on the seat, bracing herself. "Well, listen, why couldn't we get married? And then you could keep going, at least for a while." "I'd probably have a baby, and that would be that." "What's wrong with that? What's better than being a mother?" But Bobby had a notion about herself, had had it since she was a little girl. She had read about Helen Keller and Madame Curie. She admired Eleanor Roosevelt, and that's how she thought of herself, a woman who could do something. "I do want to be a mother," Bobby finally said. "I just want to finish college first. Maybe we could get married when I'm a senior, when I only have a few months to go, 6 months or something like that." "That's still a year and a half from now. Bobby, come on, we're in love. How can we wait that long?" Bobby knew what that meant, but she had never felt the urgency that she sensed from him. He never got out of line, but sometimes when they kissed, he held her very close and then pushed himself away in an act of obvious self-control. It was something she wondered about. Why didn't she feel the same ache? She actually longed to feel that way, had imagined sometimes that she would someday have that kind of need for someone. "Bobby, I can wait, but not 2 years, not even a year and a half." "So what are you saying? You're the one who decides?" Phil turned onto State Street and drove north with both hands on the wheel. Bobby knew he was angry. She saw the little muscle by his ear form a lump as he clenched his jaw. She almost wished he would explode, really fight with her. "Bobby," he finally said, "I don't know how to say this. I don't want to sound like a tough guy, but I do think before we get married, we both need to know who wears the pants in the family." "I have a nice new pair of slacks," Bobby said. "You told me they look good on me." "Bobby, this isn't funny. You know what I'm talking about." "Yes, I know exactly. You want to make my decisions for me." She was being nasty now, and she knew it, but he might as well know what he was up against. "I didn't say that, and you know it. But I am going to be the patriarch in our family. I am expected to lead." "Oh, yes, sir. Just command me, and I will obey." She slid a little farther away. Phil took a long breath, held it longer than seemed possible, and then gradually let it seep out. "Bobby, you've never talked to me like this before. And you've never talked to me this way. This is the first I've heard about you being my boss." "I didn't say that." "Patriarch doesn't mean you rule. That's what a boss does." "Who leads your family?" "My dad, more than he should. Mom ought to stand up to him more often than she does." Phil turned now, took a good look into Bobby's eyes, but she didn't blink. I can't believe I'm hearing this. You have not been raised this way. Bobby felt the guilt more than she wanted to. Phil, come on, I'm not trying to steal your pants from you. You can patriarch me all you want, but you can't make decisions by yourself and tell me to like it or lump it. Do you really think I would do that? No, she didn't. But it took her the better part of a minute to talk herself into saying, I'm sorry, Phil. I know you aren't that way, but our first decision is to set a date for our wedding, and I don't want to get married right away. I can't just say, whatever you think, when I feel that way. Phil was nodding, thinking. Listen, honey, I think we need to talk this through, maybe get our parents' opinions and— No. What? You know what my dad would say, so would yours. And maybe for good reason, Phil said. I don't care. All you patriarchs are not going to get together and overrule me. Bobby, what a thing to say! And she knew it. She was being irreverent, and even though she rather liked the feel of it, in the long run she couldn't do this. I'm sorry, she said. Phil, I really am. But if a girl has a right to determine anything, she ought to be able to choose her own wedding date. Why can't we decide together? Phil was driving more slowly all the time, seeming not to concentrate on the car, and the traffic was streaming past them. We can, I guess, but I'm not going to be pushed into going ahead with it this fall. Fine, I can live with that, but I can't live with 2 years. Can't we find some middle ground? I don't know. Phil braked gently for a red light. Well, okay, he said. This will be our first challenge. We'll learn about talking things out and finding answers. We'll ask the Lord, for one thing. We really should have done that already. And yet even that bothered Bobby. She had the feeling that once all the patriarchs got lined up with Mom and Phil's mom, and they started claiming that God was voting on their side, she would get steamrolled. But what was she thinking? The Lord should strike her down this instant. Why couldn't she just be happy she had found such a good man, and thankful? There were beautiful girls at the U who were crazy with jealousy that Bobby, freckle-faced little Bobby, had managed to harvest the pick of the crop. She slid back and took Phil's arm. I don't mean to be difficult, she said. Maybe I just have to get used to the idea. It's all a big adjustment for me. And with that she saw Phil's chest rise, his chin come up. He was the pants-wearer after all. Bobby couldn't help being annoyed by his satisfaction, but she told herself she loved him, and she would make this work. It is a big adjustment, he said kindly, but we'll know when it's right, and I promise you, Bobby, I'll treat you like an angel. I always will. That's what you are to me, and I could never treat you any other way. So what was all that business about wearing the pants, Bobby wondered. But she said nothing more. She leaned her head against his shoulder. I know you'll treat me right, she said. I just hope I'll treat you the way I should. Hey, you're feisty all right, but it's one of the things I like about you. Phil, I feel like I'm walking into a dark tunnel, and I don't know who I'll be when, and if, I get to the other end. I've always thought for myself, and I don't want to give that up. Can you understand that? Of course, honey, a man feels those things too. I like my independence as much as the next guy, but I want to be one flesh with someone I love, and I want to create a posterity. It's a beautiful thing, Bobby, the greatest thing there is in life. Bobby believed all that, always had, but why did he make it sound so functional? He patted her leg again and then left his hand on her thigh. You're just a little frightened of having a man in your bed. There's a lot to get used to. Bobby sat up straighter, moved her head away from his shoulder. Oh, hey, I'm sorry, I don't mean to sound like that. I'll always be tender with you, I promise that too. Bobby didn't doubt that either, but she didn't want to think about it. She didn't want to think at all. Later that night, after Phil had brought her home and kissed her goodnight, Bobby walked upstairs. She tried to walk softly past Wally's room, but Wally heard her and came out, wearing his old green pajamas. Sis? Are you okay? Of course. Did he give you the ring? She stretched her hand out. She had thought of waking her parents and showing them. She knew they expected it, but she had decided they could see it in the morning. Wow, that's a lot of stones. That much weight is going to stretch your arm. It's pretty, isn't it? Yeah, I guess. Are you sure you're okay? Wally, that one night I talked to you, I was just in a bad mood and sort of upset with him. But we've worked everything out. I'm really happy now. You don't seem all that happy, if you want to know the truth. I'm just thinking about everything. It's a happy event, but it's also sacred. I'm just feeling really thankful and pleased. Well, Okay, that's good, but it seems like it ought to be exciting, too. Oh, it is. I'm excited, really. But it's one thing to think about getting married when you're a little girl. It's something else to know you're grown up and you have to take on the responsibilities that come with marriage. Wally gave her a curious look, as though the words didn't sound right to him. Well, anyway, I hope you're going to be really happy and everything. I'm sure I will be, Bobby said, and she stepped into her room. Then, without turning the lights on, she walked to the window. The moon was casting a glow through the apple tree. Bobby could see the dark limbs like arms. She thought of all the times she had climbed that tree when she was a girl. Those summer days when the apples were still not ripe. Dad had always told her not to eat the apples yet, that they would make her sick. But she had eaten them anyway, green, and she had loved them. Now she remembered herself, perched in those limbs, a salt shaker in one hand, an apple in the other, and suddenly she wished more than anything that she could have that time, that Bobby, back. Chapter 8. When the knocking began, Elder Thomas thought he had overslept, but the room was dark and he realized that it was still early. He grabbed his robe and hurried to the door. He was surprised to see Peter Stoltz standing there, wide-eyed, his hair ruffled as though he had just gotten out of bed. "Anna is very sick," he insisted. "Can you come? Mama wants you." Yes, come in for a moment. No, I'll start back on my bicycle. Come as quickly as you can." Elder Sawyer was already getting out of bed. Both elders dressed quickly, saying very little to each other. But in the courtyard, when they were getting their bikes, Elder Sawyer said, "Do they understand about administering? Is that what they want?" "Yes, I think so. I told them about it." The elders pumped hard. They left their bicycles in front of the Stoltz's building and they hurried up the stairs. When they reached the landing, Peter was standing in the doorway. "Come in," he said. He walked on through the living room to a hall and then stopped by a door and motioned the elders in. Inside, the room was lighted dimly by a single lamp in the corner. Frau Stoltz had been sitting by the bed. She stood up, still holding a basin and a washcloth. "Thank you," she said. "What's wrong?" "Influenza." Elder Thomas heard the despair in Frau Stoltz's voice. "How bad is she?" "Not good. Not good at all. The doctor comes every day, but now he says we can only wait and see. Her fever is very high." Elder Thomas stepped closer to the bed, and he was astounded by what he saw. Anna's eyes were sunken, her face skeletal and white. Frau Stoltz had been wiping Anna's face with a damp cloth, and her hair was matted. She seemed to have no substance, as though she were as thin as the sheet over her. She was dying, Elder Thomas realized, and he felt a sudden panic. "She was talking to us until last night, but now she is sinking." Frau Stoltz began to cry. "Will you bless her? Can you bring her back?" Elder Thomas had only administered to one other person in his life. No one had ever asked him to bring someone back from the edge of death. "We do have the power," he said, frightened to make a promise. He reached into his pocket and grasped the little bottle of oil. "Where is Herr Stoltz?" he asked. "He doesn't believe in this. He wants nothing to do with it. He's very angry right now, Bruder Thomas. He can't bear this. I don't know what he'll do." Elder Thomas could feel the weight. He wished he had his father with him, or an apostle, someone with deeper faith, greater power. "Frau Stoltz," he said, "I need to be ready. I want to pray. Could I go into the living room for a moment?" "Of course, go ahead, but don't take too long." Elder Thomas looked at his companion. "Come with me," he said, and the two walked to the living room. So the elders knelt together, and Elder Thomas prayed. "Father in heaven," he said, "I'm scared. I'm not big enough for this." And then he explained that the Stoltzes were honest and good, and they were worthy of such a blessing. "Please, Father, don't let my weakness stand in their way. Trust in Frau Stoltz's faith more than in mine or Elder Sawyer's." Elder Thomas's voice came close to pinching off. "I've never been asked to do anything so important as this, Lord. I trust in Thee to put the right words in my mouth, that I may speak Thy words, not mine." When Elder Thomas got up from his knees, he was feeling better, but he was still scared. He looked at his companion. "It'll be all right," Elder Sawyer said. Elder Thomas wiped the tears from his cheeks. He took a breath. He wanted to walk back into that bedroom with some confidence, but his thoughts were running fast. What if he blessed her to live and she died? What would Herr Stoltz say? "You anoint her, okay?" Elder Thomas told his companion. "Just do it in English." When the two returned to Anna's bedroom, Elder Thomas nodded to Frau Stoltz to assure her, but he could feel his hands shake as he handed the vial of oil to Elder Sawyer. "What's Anna's full name?" he asked Frau Stolz. "Anna Eleonora Stolz." Frau Stolz was grasping her hands together, her fingers tightly laced. "What should I do?" "You and Peter just stand here close. Listen to the blessing. Pray with us. Add your faith to ours." Peter nodded and stepped close. His eyes were wide, almost frantic. Elder Thomas touched his companion's shoulder, and Elder Sawyer stepped forward. He leaned over and let a little drop of oil fall onto Anna's forehead, at the hairline, and then he turned and handed the bottle and the lid to Elder Thomas. It all seemed rather awkward, but Elder Sawyer did say the prayer all right, and then Elder Thomas stepped closer to join him. Anna's bed was low, and the elders had to bend down and reach rather far to place their hands on her head. Elder Thomas felt the heat in her head, heard her take a longer breath, as if in response to the touch. And then he felt something else. As he shut his eyes, he felt his chest swell and fill with calm. All the shaking stopped, and he knew. The words were easy. He sealed the anointing, and then he said, "Anna, you have important reasons to stay upon this earth. We command you, in the name of the Lord, to be restored to your full health and well-being. Return to us and be healed." Later, he would try to remember what he had said. But what he would remember more than anything was the feeling that had come over him, the overwhelming love he felt for the Lord, for Anna and her family, and the light that seemed to fill him up.